Howdy, folks. This is Tony here, and in today's episode of Joe Biden Says Whatever the Hell He Wants, we've got a comment Joe Biden just made where he says Americans would need an F-16 to take on the government. Now, he has said this multiple times before. He's no stranger to threats and intimidation. He would actually make a great mob boss when you sit back and think about it. But before I talk about this issue, because this is a Second Amendment video and a lot of people would like to have this kind of video taken down, I must give the disclaimer. I don't condone of using weapons to attack, harass, or threaten innocent people. Which is exactly what Joe Biden is doing with this statement. He is threatening his fellow Americans with F-16s, which is quite egregious when you sit back and think about it. Now, I am going to take apart his argument piece by piece because there is so much wrong with it. So I want to keep this short. Let's get into it. He says here that he's mocking Americans who stand on their Second Amendment rights by saying, if you want to work against the government, you need an F-16. Now, let me first start with the obvious, the F-16 itself. When you demoralize the people who would pilot the F-16, when you shrink their numbers with all of these unconstitutional medical mandates, when you further shrink their morale with all of this absurd gender ideology that you want to shove down their throats, and then when you completely compromise their security position by letting China fly its spyware all across our country, all of a sudden that F-16 that you want to brag about is no longer as effective as you think it would be. That's the first obvious thing. I find it highly ironic that the most anti-military president in our nation's history is bragging about why he would use the military against American citizens. That's egregious and it's absurd, as I've said before. How about we use that F-16 to secure our borders? How about we use that F-16 to defend ourselves if a nation like China were to attack us? But no, instead of the obvious uses for military equipment, or how about we use that F-16 to go get back our other F-16s from the Taliban that you left behind? But no, instead of those practical and morally righteous uses of an F-16, you want to use that now weakened F-16 to intimidate and harass and threaten innocent American civilians. That's beyond the pale. I feel like this comment should somehow be impeachment territory, but I'll be honest with you, the congressional Republicans are so slow to get anything done, I highly doubt Biden's actually going to be impeached if it does happen sometime within this term. So that's just me stating the obvious. But it says if you want to work against the government, you need an F-16. Now, here's why I do believe this is most certainly a veiled threat. This is not merely an observation. He is saying that you're powerless against the United States government. Well, if the civilians with their AR-15s are so powerless against the American government, then please explain to me why you want to take their AR-15 away. If they're not a threat with the AR-15 because you've got your F-16s, then why do you care if they have the rifles or not? Either your F-16 makes you all powerful and you don't need to worry about what the commoners are using, or deep down you know that that F-16 does not make you all powerful, so you are worried about the rifles that the commoners have. You can't have it both ways, Joe. Pick one. But he can't even pick what he's going to wear that day. He probably has to get led around even in his own house. But anyway, let's go down further to some of the garbage that spews out of Joe's mouth. It says, Sleepy Joe blathered about the Second Amendment at a private residence fundraiser in California. Oh yeah, the perfect place to talk about gun safety when they have some of the highest violent crime rates in America and those gun laws aren't really keeping them safe. The irony here is just palpable. Anyway, he says, and this is something very important, whenever you hear a politician start a statement by saying, I support the Second Amendment, but just take it to the bank, they don't support the Second Amendment. And that's exactly what Joe is doing here. He says, and guess what? It doesn't say you can own any weapon you want. Dude, that's literally what it says. It says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Uninfringed means it doesn't have limitations put on it. It doesn't have stipulations attached to it. It doesn't have conditions attached to it. I would actually argue that if someone's gone to jail and done their time, and they've made amends for whatever they've done, they would get a Second Amendment right. But anyway, literally uninfringed means that the government can't tell you not to own something. He says, it says there are certain weapons that you just can't own. Oh, please point to me an article or an amendment in the United States Constitution or Declaration of Independence that says there's certain weapons you can't own, because you're not going to find it. He just pulled this out of his rear end. Even during when it was passed, which I'll ignore how grammatically horrendous that sentence is, even when it was passed, you couldn't own a cannon. Now, I just want to park it right here and dispel a myth that a lot of people believe about weapons ownership in the United States and its history. Let's think about how things are now versus how they were back then. Now, in today's world, the military has a huge budget, and the military has an enormous budget because you're taxed more than you ever were before. They are actually able to invent the latest and greatest weapon, and then by the time it hits the civilian market, you get the neutered version of it, right? So we're used to living in a world where the military has infinitely more advanced weapons than the private citizens do. Please understand something. This isn't how America was founded. There was a time in this country where civilians owned more advanced weaponry than the government did, and the government actually purchased rifles that were invented for the civilian market. They brought it to the military base or to the military lab, and they doctored it up, and that's how they get their weapon. It's not that the citizens should get the crumbs from the military. No, the military used to get the crumbs from the citizens, because back when our country was founded, your dollar wasn't taxed a million different ways to have a bloated military budget wherein you can just spend it on all kinds of weapons research. Lockheed Martin and Boeing did not rule the world back then the way that they do now. So just understand that back then, a lot of times the militia or the armies, that was private civilians bringing their privately owned weapon, which a lot of times was custom made or was better than what the standard issue military weapon was. They brought their private weapon onto the battlefield. So they actually had the better rifle. They had the better flintlock. They had the better musket. They had weapons that were one step ahead of what the military had. This idea of the military should be all powerful and the civilian should be less than half of that, it has not always been that way, and that's not how America ought to be organized, because that's not how America was founded. Anyway, it says, he said, it doesn't say you can own any weapon you want, and then he says right here, you can't own a machine gun. You guys need to look something up. When you go to DuckDuckGo, when you get home, look up something called the Puckle gun. The Puckle gun was a machine gun that did exist back then. This argument that because certain type of weapons did not exist when the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, therefore you cannot apply those rights to those weapons. Well, first of all, machine guns totally did exist 250 years ago. They were a thing. Look it up. You really think that it was in the last 100 years that somebody decided to make something that throws a lot of bullets quickly? Oh no, that's been in the works for a very, very long time. But I disagree not with the application of the argument, but with the substance of the argument. He's saying that your rights are limited to what technology existed when those rights were enshrined in law. Okay, so by that logic, why then would you say First Amendment applies to your email and to your telephone call and to your text message and to your YouTube video when those technologies did not exist back then? So are we going to say that this First Amendment only applies to what you write down on a quill pen and a piece of parchment? Because modern line paper didn't exist back then either. So how are we going to handle this argument, Joe? This doesn't make any sense. Rights are absolute regardless of the technology that exists when those rights are enshrined in law. Now, here's what he says here. He says, I love these guys who say that the Second Amendment is, the tree of liberty is water. I can't get past this bad grammar. It should be the tree of liberty is watered, but I'm sure Joe Biden said it that way, with the blood of patriots. Now notice how Biden breaks the phrase in half and ignores the second half, because I believe it was Thomas Jefferson who said, from time to time, the tree of liberty needs to be refreshed with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Whenever Joe Biden quotes it, he takes the and tyrants part off because he doesn't want to be seen as a tyrant, when that's exactly what he is, when he's threatening to use the United States military, a military he has neutered, mind you, against its own civilians. What a sad day that we live in with the current president, in quotation marks, of the White House. And he's actually been carrying through on this threat, by the way, because he's been using the IRS and the Department of Justice to target gun stores, like what he just did in Oregon. Look that up, or is it, excuse me, not Oregon, in Montana. So, yeah, it's right here. He just raided a Montana gun store. So, what we need to understand is we are living in times where the government wants to control the people, not answer to the people. And when that happens, all hell could break loose. Now, I personally believe very strongly in not solving problems with weapons where words would do. Educate the next generation. Educate those low information voters. I think that, for example, politicians who are pro-gun, you need to go to the hood and talk to those people about why the Second Amendment is important and why they need to stop voting Democrat, despite the fact that that's what their ancestors have done for the last 50 or 60 years. You need to go to the rural areas where people think, oh, well, that candidate supports unions, I should vote for him. Go talk to those people. Go educate them on why they need to change the way that they vote. This whole idea of conservative, pro-Second Amendment politicians who only want to talk about civil liberties and interest rates and government spending, listen, the everyday Joe Blow has no idea what any of that means. Talk to them in terms they can understand, and maybe you'll win the vote, and maybe we can turn some of this around. Anyway, that is my take on the situation. Let me know what you think in the comments below.